you know that your camera shutter is a powerful tool that allows you to change the exposure and the look of the images that you're taking? What you might not realize is how incredible the engineering behind modern cameras' shutter mechanisms actually are. They are so fast and precise that even if you get your settings just a tiny little bit wrong, your photos can absolutely be ruined. So today I'm going to break down everything you need to know about shutter speed and the 3 most common shutter speed mistakes that amateur photographers like you and I make all of the time. Also, if you're a beginner or intermediate photographer and you want to take your photography to that next level, I've got a 30-day fundamentals training launching very, very soon, where I'm going to teach you everything that I've learned from taking over 100,000 images and having my photos viewed on this channel, at this point, millions and millions of times. So click the link in the description below this video to secure your spot in the training, and let's get back into it. So before we get into the mistakes, we've got to really understand what a camera shutter actually does. Now, this is going to sound a little bit weird, right? But imagine your camera shutter acting like a pair of curtains. So when you press the shutter button, one curtain comes down and then light hits your sensor. Following this, the second curtain comes down and then it stops the exposure altogether. And interestingly, these curtains move at the same speed every single time, no matter what your settings are. So when you adjust your shutter speed, you're actually changing the gap between one curtain and then the second curtain, rather than the speed of the curtains themselves. So let me give you an example. So let's say at a shutter speed of 1 second, well, the first curtain is going to move, then nothing's going to happen, then the second curtain is going to move. Whereas at 1/500th of a second, the first curtain moves and then the second one follows it before the first curtain has finished. And let's go a little bit more crazy here. At 1/8000th of a second, only a sliver of a gap is available for the light to hit the sensor because the curtains are so close together. So that gap between the curtains, that is your shutter speed. The smaller the gap, the faster the exposure. Now, here's where things get interesting from a practical perspective. If your shutter speed is too slow, the gap between the two curtains is going to be a decent amount of time, right? Which means that any movement of your sensor or the subject during the time that your sensor is exposed is going to lead to a blurred image. Alternatively, if your shutter speed is too fast, then the gap is going to be barely open, meaning that you're going to get a super sharp photo, but potentially just completely black or very dark image. So understanding how your shutter physically works is the first step to fixing mistakes, because once you see really what's happening behind the scenes, you're going to start spotting exactly why your shutter speed might be ruining your shots. And that leads us to another crucial piece of this puzzle, because we don't just have traditional mechanical shutters anymore. We've now got electronic shutters and also global shutters on top. Okay, so you might be sat there thinking, hey, my fancy camera has no mechanical curtains, no mechanical shutter, it only uses an electric shutter. Heck, if you are very fancy, you might have a camera that has a global shutter. So how do all of those work together? Well, most cameras use a rolling exposure to expose an image. This means that the sensor reads the data from the photo sites line by line by line from top to bottom. Now, an electronic shutter works a little bit differently. Instead of using physical curtains to block light from hitting the sensor, it reads the image line by line from top to bottom, and the exposure is controlled by the length of time that the photo sites are active rather than the physical curtains blocking the light that's coming in through the lens and then hitting them. So that's an electronic shutter, and most cameras, even if they have a mechanical shutter, they will have an electronic shutter settings. And finally, with the launch of the Sony A9 III, we now have a global shutter camera on the market as well. A global shutter exposes all of the photo sites together, and this ensures that the entire image is captured all at once, rather than sequentially with things like a rolling shutter. For all intents and purposes though, for shutter speed mistakes we're going to cover in this video right now, the type of shutter that you have doesn't really matter. What we're concerned about is the shutter speed itself rather than the mechanism behind that shutter speed. So let's get into some actual mistakes that people make with the shutter speed, starting with the one that can leave your images either completely underexposed or just full of horrible noise. A lot of beginners assume that a faster shutter speed always equals a sharper image. If you just crank up the shutter speed, you can freeze basically anything, right? Well, kind of, not exactly. Yeah, a faster shutter speed can help freeze motion, but there is a catch to that. And the catch is your camera can't just magically make things brighter when you increase your shutter speed. In fact, the opposite is going to happen. A fast shutter speed means less light hitting your sensor, which can leave you with a underexposed, noisy, or just plain awful image. This is why shooting at 1/400th of a second works great in bright daylight, but if you use the same shutter speed in the morning's blue hour, your image is going to come out as if you took it in the dark. So you always have to balance having a faster shutter speed, which will reduce the movement in your image, making it look potentially sharper. You got to balance all that with the amount of light that is available. And remember this, a slightly soft subject in your image that is correctly exposed, so we can actually see it, is always going to be better than a tack sharp image of a completely black frame. So yes, fast shutter speeds do work to create sharper photos, but only if you understand how to balance them with light. Next, let's see how your lens's focal length affects the shutter speed that you should be using when you're trying to create long distance tack sharp photos. Have you ever taken what you thought was going to be a perfectly steady shot with a long lens, and you zoom in when you get on the computer to find that it's actually pretty blurry? Well, that's because long lenses amplify small movements in your camera body or the lens itself. Think like this, even with the same small angle of movement from a wobbly camera, a telephoto lens will have more movement of your subject because that angle is amplified over the distance that you're shooting your photo from. And of course, the more movement that you have of your subject in the frame when you take your image, then the more the image is going to be smeared across the sensor and the softer the image is going to appear. And luckily for us, this is a pretty easy fix here. We should implement the 2x shutter speed rule. So this is dead simple. Take your focal length, let's say we're shooting at 300mm, and then we double it. So that should be your minimum shutter speed. So for a 300mm lens, you need at least a 600th of a second shutter speed to avoid camera shake, or to dramatically reduce it. And what is happening here is that we are engineering a situation where the shutter speed is going to be open just long enough to grab your image, but not long enough that the small movements of the system, as you wobble it around, whether that be the camera body, the sensor, the lens, any movement then smears the image across the sensor as you expose it for a longer period of time. And of course, if you're shooting handheld, image stabilization helps, but it's certainly not magic. Faster shutter speeds are always going to be safer when you're shooting at that telephoto distance. So if you've ever wondered why your long lens shots aren't as sharp as your wide angle shots, it's probably down to your shutter speed. But what happens if you have the opposite problem? What happens if your subjects look too sharp? They are frozen in time and they've got no sense of movement. That's where our next mistake comes in. Now, there is a sweet spot of shutter speed when it comes to implementing motion blur into our images. Too much and the blur just makes the image into a complete horrible chaotic smear. Too little movement from a fast shutter speed and the shot just looks clinical and all a bit weird and gross. And one of the reasons this happens is that beginner photographers hesitate to slow down their shutter speed enough. They're typically nervous of it. They're afraid of overdoing it. And so most people err on the side of caution. But that hesitation is what makes images feel like stiff and that there's no energy and there's just a lack of movement across the frame. So let's say you are trying to capture a waterfall or a seascape, something with moving water. If your shutter speed is too fast, the water looks frozen, like a solid block of ice. If your shutter speed is too slow, conversely, then the entire thing turns into just a featureless white mist. And some fine art landscape photographers like this look, and it's perhaps used appropriately in certain places, but for most people, it looks a little bit naff. For me, the magic happens somewhere between around 1/4 of a second to 1/15th of a second, those kind of shutter speeds. And obviously it depends then on how fast the water that you're photographing is moving. And this doesn't just apply to water, it applies to if you're photographing crowds, traffic within a city, someone dancing, something fancy and arty like that. If you want to make motion look intentional, you've got to slow down the shutter enough so that there is a bit of a blur and it still feels fluid, but it's well controlled. It looks like you've done it intentionally. So that is how camera shutters work, and the 3 mistakes that photographers often make with their shutter speeds. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to keep leveling up your photography skill, then why not watch the video that's on the screen right now.